Well, good day. I hope December's treating you well. We are excited to have you joining us in today's Firestorm webinar. This is part of the 2017 webinar Crisis Coach webinar series that we do with RenWeb, and we're very excited about the relationship that's somewhere between 4 and 5 years old now. We're going to specifically today talk about 2017 and review the year in crisis, what we saw, what we heard about, what's going on, what are some of the lessons learned that we can take away that would impact your school and make a difference. Let's see if I can get this to advance down to the next slide. That would be a good thing. There we go. Eventually it'll work. We'd like you to be our friend on social media. You see all the options that are listed there. There is a hashtag for today's session, and that's hashtag Crisis Coach. The exercise is not complete without the oral commentary, and we have attorneys just like everybody else, and so they make us have disclaimers, and the work products that we distribute must be viewed in light of what your attorneys say and local and regional authorities. And moreover, we're not doing legal advice today. So, by the way, if you came to me for legal advice, that's probably not a good decision on your part. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. We empower you to manage crisis and risk. Our expertise is crisis management, crisis critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We are America's crisis coach, and that balance between crisis and risk, it covers everything that we do. And we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. So we're going to talk today to RenWeb schools. We've had the relationship, as I said, 4 or 5 years, and RenWeb does a phenomenal job supporting independent and private schools internationally as you look at that base. I don't remember the exact count today, but it's over 4,500, approaching 5,000 schools use it, and there are certain features within it that are extremely valuable that can be used in disasters and crises. And if you want to talk about that, we certainly would be glad to speak with you individually, or as would the RenWeb people themselves. You can go to firestorm.com and view past RenWeb webinars that have been produced, as well as download other materials, as well as register for future webinars. And we'll talk about some of those today in our process. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm President and CEO of Firestorm and a co-founder, and we're glad to be speaking with you again today. We really wanted to focus on 2017, the crises that occurred all year long, looking at what we learned from those. What does that mean to you and your school? Where should you be putting your focus at this point in time? And you probably remember a lot of the headlines through the year and events, and we're thinking about those, and that's the reason why you're joining us either live today or in a recorded version of this on-demand webinar. So when we do this, we many times produce a document called an infograph, where we put all of the information in a continuous feed document that you can go through and reference. And by the way, the one I'm going to use today, you can download off our website and share it with your team in your school. So what I'm going to do is click out of this webinar with this PowerPoint, and I'm going to go over and open this PDF right in front of you. And that PDF is talking about hashtag A Year in Crisis 2017. And we're going to go through and talk about this, and then you'll have this document that you can use within your school. In the left-hand column, you'll see some information that would be usable and shareable, as well as some other crises. We're generally going to be talking about crises in the center, and then some of the research and surveys that we've done with the Firestorm surveys, so that you've got factual data to back up some of the decisions and recommendations that you want to do within your organization. We divided the crises into violent, nonviolent, and natural disasters today. We've got an awful lot to talk about in each of those categories, and we're going to open with violent. And the reason for that is we are seeing violence increase across the country. I regularly speak to groups and organizations, and I generally ask questions, in America today, do you feel that violence is increasing or decreasing? And unanimously, I'm seeing that people feel that it is in fact increasing. And that's, as you see some of these examples today, I think will serve as a reinforcement, and it does impact us in our school environment directly. This year started off with the shootings in Fort Lauderdale at the airport, the Hollywood International Airport there in Fort Lauderdale, and that was on January 6th. So it didn't take us long to have an active shooter. I also think that this sent a significant impact given the number of travelers that we have across the country and the ease of access into airports. And this happened pre the screening area. So clearly an open environment that a gun could enter into those areas. And it sends a real message when we see something happening in a school or in a place that has easy access. The first Firestorm survey that I wanted to give you those results is over in the right-hand column. And we asked both businesses and schools and organizations of all type how about their ability to respond in an active shooter situation. And it's very surprising here that half felt they were very concerned about their ability to handle an active shooter event and to respond to it effectively. As we scroll down in the infographic, you start to see other headings come up and some hashtags and trends that we're monitoring. And then you see the United Airlines reference. You may remember that back in April. This is the passenger that was dragged off the airplane by security guards. He literally was mugged and hit and dragged down that aisle. And it's an example of how violence and affects us in workplaces in a variety of areas. It also shows that how you respond to it will go a long way in framing the image of an organization. The CEO of United Airlines in the first 24 hours was stating that his people did the right things. And as it later turned out, no, in fact, they didn't do the right things. They created a problem as a result of that. And his comments were received very poorly by everyone who'd heard, and it cost him the opportunity to move in to become chairman of United Airlines. So how you communicate in a crisis becomes very critical, and you'll see a common theme across all the events we're talking about being the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say. So we think that a culture of preparedness is a fundamental responsibility within our organizations, particularly as we talk today to schools where you have care, custody, and control, and parents are looking that their children return at the end of the school day from you. Look at the survey to the right, and this one caught me by surprise. Many times the percentages and the analysis are things that would be a match, but we do a lot of work in looking at how organizations can be impacted, and this one was one around unethical behavior. And you'll see the people in our organizations would never do anything unethical. It's staggering to me that 72% felt like they couldn't say that or they were unsure. Only 28% felt that their organization wouldn't do anything unethical. And that gave me pause and might give you pause as you think about your school and the opinions of the parents and staff, faculty and staff that you have. Now we had other events during the year. Right there in the center you see a gas worker who was shot and killed. And think about the exposure that the electric company, the gas company, the phone company, cable company, people who are going out and dealing with the public, maybe cutting off a service and getting a reaction back. It seems that guns become a reaction here and violence in terms of a response. Now to the left-hand column, we see a good news story. Here is an attempted mass shooting plot at a middle school in Orlando. This happened earlier in the year, and it was stopped because the behaviors of concern were identified and there was an intervening before it escalated to a violence act. And the police we're able to stop that event from occurring. And that's a pretty important element. So when we think about active shooter and we think about all of those types of things, identifying behaviors of concern, having open source intelligence, getting you information so that you can intervene before that behavior escalates into violence is absolutely critical in our schools today. We did a survey across organizations, both businesses and schools, to say, does your organization have a documented and trained program to identify behaviors of concern before violence? And 40% said, no, we don't have that. You'll see 14%, hey, we've got something in writing, but it's really written and we're not following it. So that means we're missing an opportunity to recognize this and intervene. And Firestorm has a program called Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment. Acronym for that is BRTHA, that is being rolled out into both public and private and schools across the country, and is something that would make a difference within your school. Now, as we've thought about violence to this point, and we're still in the violence component of our discussion, we had the bombing attack that happened at the Ariana concert in England this year. It happened in May. And obviously, you look at those types of events and you think of going to a concert that it would be just a pleasant day and good things happening. But terrorism is very real and it is very apparent. And one of the things that we projected at the start of last year is the types of events that we were seeing in Europe, and particularly in England, would be coming here to the States. And particularly the terrorist attacks. And as you know, this year, we've had 2 attacks in New York City, one with the truck and another with a pipe bomb, just very, very recently. So that's something to think of. I also want to establish in your mind the concept of situational awareness. You go to a concert or you go to a mall or you go out to dinner, you should be aware of who's around you, what's going on. If you had to evacuate, which direction would you move? What's the correct response to do in those particular situations? And I think it's a call for us to increase that level of awareness. Now, in June of this year, we had a shooting in Florida at a small business, 34 employees. And you'll see from that headline in the right-hand column that 5 were killed by an active shooter. Now, this was a former employee who came back to the office and killed those individuals. So we had previous relationships, we had behaviors of concern, and we had 5 out of 34 people killed. Think of the percentage that is of the total workforce associated with it. So being aware and knowing. Now, the statistics are in dealing with an active shooter, in all likelihood, a high percentage that it's someone that you know, a current student, a current employee, or a former employee. That's why identifying behaviors of concern and intervening in those processes make a big, big difference. Now, we had lots of related stories around violence, and you see the one in the left-hand column about the hospital where the doctor brought a gun in and shot a rifle. Healthcare facilities are extremely prone to violence. We want our hospitals and those facilities to be open so it's easy access. So this represents a workplace event. It also shows how a current employee became the perpetrator here. The example I gave you earlier in Florida was a former employee. So you can start to see that this is a common theme when we focus on violence. Now, violence doesn't have to be just a shooting event or a bomb or those types of things. We've got the Ohio State Fair here where the equipment broke, and unfortunately there was a death from just going to the fair and riding. We had civil unrest in Virginia and Charlottesville, and that was with the removal of the Confederate monuments. And we're in a strange time in America. We don't speak with each other, we speak at each other. And as emotions escalate and the violence potential is there, it certainly is one that could have those elements to expand. Being aware of what's going on in your community and the potential impact that it would have upon your school is an extremely important element to think about. Now, as we scroll down below that, a couple of other things come up. Over in the left-hand column, you see the shooting at a restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina. Imagine going out to dinner and having an event occur while you were at dinner. This is something that's permeating an entire environment in which we're in. Our schools, our concerts, our work locations, and as you'll see in a minute, I'll remind you, even our churches. When you look at the level of concern about workplace violence, that statistic in the Firestorm survey to the right is fairly staggering. 89% were either very concerned or somewhat concerned about workplace violence. That's a massive percentage of your students, of your teachers, of your parents are concerned about those types of elements. And the more stories that come out associated with that, the higher that level of concern will become. In the center of the screen is the discussion related to the shootings at the hotel and music festival in Las Vegas this summer. Excuse me, that was more recent than summer. And when you look at that event, 50 were killed, over 200 were injured. It's the largest episode of a mass shooting in the United States. And this comes back to situational awareness as we talked about it. Some of the people at the concert decided that they could help themselves if they laid down and laid still. Well, what they became were easier targets for the gunman. So moving away, being cognizant of where's the fire coming from, putting something between you and that source could have saved more lives. I would encourage you to be aware of your surroundings at all times and where you would go once you see an event starting to occur. We'll mention the shooting one more time in a few minutes, but this concept of situational awareness is one that's extremely important. Also, having a plan for your family and a plan at home. On the Firestorm website, you can download a book called Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America. It's about doing a plan at home. And it steps you through all of the things that you need. I would strongly encourage you to have your teachers download the book and have a disaster plan at home. Because if something's happening there, they have to choose between their family and their job, and family trumps job. The ability to respond to these types of events is also a concern. A Firestorm survey this year showed that 57% were not confident in their ability to respond to a loss of life incident. And by the way, this is the biggest concern that a parent has when they turn their child over to you. You have care, custody, and control. They expect their child back at the end of the school day, and that's a responsibility that you would have. The shootings are one thing, but now we're seeing vehicles, just like in the UK and Europe, being used as weapons by terrorists. If you remember in October, the attack on the bike track in lower Manhattan killed 8 people, injured others. So this is lone wolf syndrome has now come to the U.S. soil. Now, before 9/11, we all viewed the Atlantic as a major protection for us to keep the problems away from our premise. But now the person that's here can go and implement that type of an attack. A terrorist goal is to strike fear. And when you think about ordinary things that you do, placing you at risk is one. Can you imagine the impact if 12 terrorists and 12 decided to attack a school at the same time? The fear that that would instill in each of us for our children and the safety of that environment. There are multiple things, again, besides the book that you can get off our website. What are you doing before waiting for a weapon to arrive? Things that you can put into place associated with it. Here's the shooting in Texas in November. Now, this event, 26 people were killed, over 20 were wounded at that church. We think of church as a sanctuary, a place to go and to be safe. But again, this is an individual that was known to them, who'd had a background, who'd exhibited behaviors of concern, and those were missed in that process. Now, the statistics work to our advantage here. 80% of the time, if someone has ill intent, someone else knows. And 67% of the time, 2 or 4 people know. And when they know, what do? They talk. Where do they talk? They talk on social media. If you don't have an open source intelligence program monitoring social media, you're going to miss opportunities to make a difference within your school and prevent these things from happening before the gun comes to school. So I would strongly encourage you to think about those areas. Now, we spent a lot of time already talking about violent events. What other types of crises have we seen this year besides violence? Well, we're seeing lots of things happening that relate to sharing of information or access to information, cyber breach, data breach, other related items. The left-hand column is carrying a story about the Apple X phone, where an engineer's daughter posted pictures of it before its release. And you can see the impact had of that. So when we think about a breach, it can come from a variety of ways, not just a hacker going into your system. By the way, as a sidelight of that, I heard many announcers talking about that instead of iPhone 10 or the iPhone 10, to call it the iPhone X. They had forgotten their Roman numerals, so we'll have to do a better job in our schools to teach that. The second one shows how a chamber, a visitors bureau employee posted inappropriate pictures, sex videos on the internet, and we increasingly see those elements being shared. Data breach at a printing company, that's actually a law firm, had sent documents to be printed, and they were sent there and inappropriately printed and shared, and so that led to a breach from a supplier in that situation to share that information. So who's really held responsible in a crisis? And the answer is you are. Your school will be seen at fault as we think of things. As we were talking earlier about unethical behavior and being a concern with an organization, think about the new hashtag #MeToo. The role that inappropriate sexual contact and molestation is playing in our country today, and we're seeing our schools being singled out, and we're seeing reports coming in of incidents that happened 5, 10, 20, 30, and even 40 years ago. The statute of limitations protecting organizations have been waived in those types of areas, and so that's a very real threat to your organization. How concerned are you about data breach? And if you add those numbers up that you see in the right-hand column, including boards, and looking at the boards of directors of schools and businesses, this is their #1 concern. Schools are actually targeted for cyber breach because of the nature of the information that you have, the ability to have financial information on parents, personal identifiable information, and health information on your students. So that's an increasing problem and exposure that we're seeing in our schools across the country. Now, we had a power outage in San Francisco this year. That was in April. And one of the things that happens in a power outage is that you go back in time 150 years. Think about how you would run your school if you didn't have electricity. And I know I've gone into a room after when a power outage would come and flip the light switch, and I'm always surprised to see that the electricity isn't coming on. So we really need to focus on that as a real exposure. We're coming into the winter seasons with storms. I'm in the Atlanta area. We actually had 6 inches of snow over the weekend, and it disrupted over 1,100 flights. In fact, I got caught out on the West Coast and couldn't come back in. So winter storms for many of our RenWeb schools across the country would certainly be a threat. Tornadoes that come through, or if you're in California, earthquakes, or if you think beyond it, into locations where hurricanes can come into play, those types of disruptions. Our grid is under attack from a cyber perspective, and that's an ongoing exposure to be aware of. So one of the questions that comes up is, hey, can we contain this information? Can we keep it from getting out? And 80% of you have responded in the survey, nope, you're not going to be able to contain leaks and information. It's an opportunity to get that information out and to share. You see in the center of the information about the Google and the hacking that went on there and the phishing attack that came in and took advantage of those individuals. The survey results in the right showed that 48% of the organizations were training employees on phishing, because that is one of the most common problems from cyber breach. By the way, the term of art here is picnic, problem in chair, not in computer. When we think about this, it's someone who opens the door to let the hacker in, to let the criminal into the organization. And so that's an awareness training that we would recommend that you consider doing for your teachers and staff as well as your students. By the way, over in the left-hand column is another infographic that you can download, and it's regarding cybersecurity and the details and information. And if you'd like that, you can again find that on our website. The Equifax breach goes back to that accountability question that we talked about earlier. And you'll know that in that particular event, the CEO, the CFO, the Chief Information Officer, as well as the on the events. They all become elements that you need to think about. What is the impact upon our people from those types of events? Now, we had 3 Category 4 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Each one of them had a severe toll. Harvey dropping over 4 feet of water. Now, it's one thing to think about 5 feet of snow. Think about where are you going to put 4 feet of water. The impact that it had in Texas associated with it, and from the islands. The devastation in Puerto Rico is still ongoing. We have large percentages of our population, again, without electricity. Over 1,000 dead will probably be the ultimate toll in Puerto Rico. So certainly these types of natural disasters cause unnatural crises within our organizations and within our families, our schools, and our students. There were 8,400 structures lost in that wildfire in Northern California. Imagine if that was your home, with looking at that fireplace standing in the center of the screen. On the right, you'll see Hart Brown. Hart's our new Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer here at Firestorm, to us out of the Justice Department and Security, as well as cyber and cybersecurity, and has an insurance background. So you'll be hearing Hart on a lot of our webinars through the course of the year, and some additional insights that we can share with you. Again, more articles off our website that you can go to and download about natural disasters, disaster recovery. On the right, you're seeing a separate, you can download about communicating in a crisis. We'll give you some tips on that in just a few moments, but there's another resource tool that you can use with your people, and you see multiple ways to contact us. We follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. What are the vulnerabilities and threats? What are their impacts? How do you monitor? What are the triggers that would activate your plans? The plans that you need to have in place, the training, the testing, and crisis support. So those are all elements to think about as we think forward to 2018. So you can visit us at firestorm.com, or you can call us for more assistance And by the way, that number is also used 24/7 as a crisis line. If your school is in crisis, you can pick up that phone and call us and we'll respond. And there's no charge for that response for the first 24 hours. The decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say in that 24 hours will determine, is this crisis going to escalate or is it going to de-escalate? So we learned a lot in 2017. I wanted to also mention that this week we had another attack, another terrorist attack in New York City. And this was a pipe bomb in the subway. These events are very similar to what we're seeing coming out of Europe. And the only thing that helped in this area was our pipe bomber was not an efficient one. He built the bomb, got into the subway, discharged it right next to a Christmas poster, and it hoped to create greater damage. It misfired, it hurt him, injured some others, but didn't have the devastation impact. Imagine a crowded subway in the morning with everyone heading to work, how bad that particular explosion could have been. But this comes back to that situational awareness, being aware of what's going on around you and breaking that in and recognizing that we have terrorism here on U.S. soil now. The types of communications that we want you to think about in a crisis, the first is always coordination. What is it that you want your people to do? Shelter in place, evacuate, lockdown, lockout. How do those things go? Those are going to be your very first communications in any crisis. The crisis itself, the brand and reputation impact, can generally wait 24 hours. Most of what you find out initially in the crisis will be wrong, and so communicating too quickly, communicating about the wrong things can have a significantly large negative impact on your organization. And finally, compliance. In many cases, you're required to make notification in a crisis. Identity theft is an example from a cyber breach. Or because you're a teacher or a leader in a school, if you have belief or reason to believe that a student or a child is at risk, you are a mandated reporter, either to Child and Family Services or to the police. And so there are certain crisis communications that have to be made. Now, messaging becomes very important in a crisis. We did the crisis management over 10 years ago at Virginia Tech at the shootings there, and our messages were that they would not be defined by the event, that they would invent the future, and that they would embrace the families. As bad as that shooting was, it was not what Virginia Tech is about. And if there was a crisis within your school, that's not what your school is about. Look back at your mission statement to talk about it. You're going to invent the future. You're going to make sure that whatever happened doesn't happen again. What are the precautions and changes? And finally, that you're going to embrace the families, that you're going to care for those that were directly impacted. Significantly more positive statement than saying no comment. By the way, I would encourage you, particularly when we're talking about crisis communications, you can communicate directly to your students. You know how to reach them, to their parents, to your teachers and staff, as opposed to communicating through the media. In the majority of times, we would strongly encourage you not to communicate through the media at a time of crisis. Communicate directly through your channels. Now, the message that's shown here is the one that came from the mayor of Las Vegas after the shootings in October. This has been a resilient community who will not be defined by the sick, disgusting human. I will not give you a cold through the webinar today. So think about what you're missing. You know what you know, that orange quadrant of the circle on the side. What you know you don't know, you know a lot of those things. You may not know what the weather's going to be next week, but you know that you don't know that. So you can plan. But look at the blue portion of the circle. The largest exposure here is what you don't know you don't know. And thinking about the changing world that we're in and the exposures that are out there, trying to create an open source intelligence program, which you can do for as little as a few $100s, you can start to get a better understanding of what's going on around you to be prepared. There are 5 common failures in a disaster or crisis. The largest failure is failure to control critical supply chains. Second, to train your people for work and home. Third is to identify and monitor all threats and risks. Four is to not conduct exercises and update your plans. And lastly, failure to have a crisis communications plan. I'd like you to think about number 3 and number 5 on that list. You probably have done a hazard vulnerability analysis of the exposures that affect your school, thinking about those areas. I would encourage you to carry that a few steps further. Once you've identified a risk or a threat or an exposure, identify what would be the impact on your school if that were to occur. Then identify what you would need to monitor to see if that was imminent or about to happen. And then finally, what's the trigger that would cause you to go into action? And then finally, what questions would you have to answer? What communications would you need to take if that risk or threat materialized into a crisis for your organization? Planning those things out in advance will greatly improve your response and how you deal with those issues. So, looking at how you manage a crisis, this is the Firestorm maturity model for crisis management. We look at the decision processes, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, the communications effectiveness, and measure it across 4 different stages. And obviously the goal is to build your school and your leadership to where you're in that stage 3 or 4, where it's supportive or strategic within your organization. Every time you can move from one stage to the next, that's a breakthrough. Just going from a stage 1 to a stage 2 is a control breakthrough. You're in more control in that particular event. If you can move from a 2 to a 3, then that's an alignment breakthrough. You're aligning your assets and your response to give that support all the way through. But if we can get to a strategic level where it's ingrained in part of our culture, that's a value breakthrough for your school. And this is in alignment with the values that you have. You're probably very proud of your students and their academic success, and as you look at them and the percentages that go on to college and achieve great things. But you want to rank at the top of that level from a credibility standpoint. Similarly, in this area, you want to rank at the top levels in terms of being able to identify and manage crises. So now's the time to act. Predict what your vulnerabilities and threats are. What are their impacts? What are the triggers to activate your plans? Have plans for all of the exposures. Certainly violence is an increasing exposure. If you don't have plans to identify behaviors of concern, if you haven't had a current security assessment for your school, those are things to look at and plan for now. And then perform the training, the testing, the exercising of your plans, and having an access to support if in fact you had a crisis. What's next? Download the infographic that we've gone through today. You can go to firestorm.com/2017 year in review, and you can get this infographic. This is a good tool to talk about with your safety and security team, with your leadership, to say, these are the things that we face this year. What are we going to face next year? What do we need to do? You can also participate in a benchmark survey around event management. We're doing this both with businesses and schools, and we're doing it with BC Management. It's an organization that's been around since 2000. They do 6 different surveys annually, but it's a way to get that data and understand how are we relative to everyone else. So you can go to BC Management, participate in the study. There is no charge. And if you do participate, you get the report from that at no cost. In January, we'll be doing starting our 2018 RenWeb webinar series, and it's helping your school make the most of 2018. Clearly, now is the time to plan and prepare for the future. And we're going to be sharing with you new solutions from Firestorm, and I think you'll be excited about what you can take and learn in each of these areas. Our thanks to RenWeb for underwriting this webinar series and sharing it with you. And again, these have been recorded, and you can go to the Firestorm website and see them on demand. And again, they're components within the RenWeb software, the notification capability, the ability to create a central repository to maintain your evaluations of those students that are at risk. It gives you some good tools that can make a significant difference. If you've got questions, go to firestorm.com to download the articles and infographics and view the webinars. If you've got a question, you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com and we'll get back to you. Or you can call us at 800-321-2219. Or if you find yourself in a crisis, call that number, because the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say in the first hour will determine if that crisis is going to stabilize or escalate, and we'll provide you that hour of support at no cost. Don't hesitate to call. It's one of the benefits that RenWeb has arranged for your school. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for all that you do to help our students to grow from an academic and a knowledge standpoint, as well as morally and ethically. We live in challenging times. We're in a great season of the year. We're standing at the beginning of a new year. This is a time for us to act together. Thank you again. Until January, it's Jim Satterfield. Have a great December and a marvelous new year. Goodbye.